Midnight presses against the abbey walls like a held breath. You kneel on cold stone. Wax drips from a candle beside you, pooling like pale fat. The chapel smells of smoke, old wool, and something metallic. Rust or blood. Hard to tell in this light. A wooden chest sits open before the altar. Inside it rests an iron shape, not a sword, not a crown, not a relic of a saint, a belt. It curves like a jawbone, heavy, hinged, cold enough that the air around it feels sharper. You run your fingers along its edge and feel the rivets, blunt but unforgiving. The slot in the front is narrow, too narrow. It hums with the promise of control. Behind you, footsteps echo. The priest clears his throat. You are not supposed to touch it. You are not even supposed to know it exists. Because the story goes like this. When knights rode off to the Crusades in the 12th century, they locked their wives into iron chastity belts. Locked them like treasure chests. Guarded them like gold. Protected their purity with cold steel and a tiny key. Romantic, right? Wrong century. Wrong story. Possibly wrong object. Here is what matters. The medieval world was obsessed with sex. Not in a playful way, in a terrified way. Church courts policed adultery. Canon law defined marriage as a sacrament. Female bodies were described as gateways to sin. Men worried about lineage. Property passed through blood. If the bloodline got muddy, so did the inheritance. Control the womb. Control the kingdom. Simple math. But iron belts? Actual medieval wives clanking around castles like walking padlocks? The historical record grows strangely quiet when you start asking for receipts. The first clear written reference to something resembling a chastity belt appears in the early 15th century. Around 1405, in a satirical text called Bella Fortis by Conrad Kaiser, a German military engineer. He includes an illustration of a belt. It looks theatrical, almost cartoonish, accompanied by commentary that reads more like a joke than a blueprint. You start to feel the ground shift beneath the legend, because medieval satire loved exaggeration. It mocked jealousy. It mocked overprotective husbands. It mocked obsession with female chastity. Humor in the Middle Ages was darker than most horror films today. Think less romantic knight, more insecure landlord with armor. The Crusades, which ran roughly from 1096 to 1291, generated massive anxiety about absence. Men left for years. Some never returned. Property, titles, and heirs hung in limbo. But locking a woman into an iron cage for years? That would not preserve fidelity. It would preserve infection. Let me explain. Medieval hygiene was already fragile. An iron device pressed tightly against skin, worn for weeks, months, or years, would cause ulcers, sepsis, and death. No court record from the 12th or 13th century describes a woman dying from prolonged belt confinement. No church document outlines keys held by crusading husbands. No law mandates its use. Strange for something supposedly common. Instead, what we do find are sermons. Endless sermons. Warnings against lust. Instructions for modesty. Advice for husbands to guide their wives spiritually. And church courts that punished adultery when proven. Social control was real. Iron underwear might not have been. You stand in that chapel, staring at the object in the chest. The priest says it is proof. Proof that women must be guarded. Proof that desire is dangerous. But the object looks newer than the stone around it. And that detail gnaws at you. Because the Middle Ages did not need iron belts to control women. They had confessionals. They had public penance. They had shame. They had inheritance law. They had community surveillance so tight it made modern social media look private. Cold steel is dramatic. Canon law is more efficient. The belt in the chest might not be medieval at all. And if it is not medieval, then who forged it? The candle flickers. The iron glints. And somewhere between myth and metal, you realize the story you were told may have been manufactured centuries later by people who needed the Middle Ages to look barbaric. The footsteps behind you stop. The priest whispers, You do not understand what this is. He is right. You do not. Not yet. Because the real question is not whether the Middle Ages used chastity belts. The real question is who desperately wanted you to believe they did, and why. Chest snaps shut. Darkness swallows the iron. But the myth is only beginning to open. Crusaders, keys, and convenient lies. You ride with them now. Dust in your teeth. Leather biting into your thighs. A red cross stitched onto your tunic. The year is 1096. The First Crusade surges toward Jerusalem under the banner of Pope Urban II. Men chant, pray, sweat. They also worry, because when you leave for war, you leave more than land. You leave wives, young wives, fertile wives. Wives whose children will inherit your estate if you do not return. Lineage is everything. Without a legitimate heir, your bloodline fractures. Your land splinters. Your name dissolves. So the legend claims you would lock her in iron, but pause. Medieval marriage law did not function like a Hollywood script. Under canon law, marriage required mutual consent. Once married, a wife had certain recognized rights, including dower rights. If her husband died, she could claim a portion of his estate. She was not legally a pet locked in a barn. The church had its own interest in legitimate heirs, yes. But it also required consummation for a marriage to be valid. It acknowledged sexual relations within marriage as lawful and even necessary. This was not a culture allergic to sex. It was a culture obsessed with regulating it. Big difference. Let us talk practicality. A knight heading to the Levant might be gone for years. A metal belt would require a key. Who keeps it? The husband? What if he dies in Antioch? What if he is captured? What if he never returns? Does she rust quietly forever? The logistics alone collapse the fantasy. And yet, paintings from later centuries show knights handing tiny keys to tearful brides. A gesture so cinematic it practically begs for a soundtrack. Those images appear mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries, not the 12th. Here is where the plot thickens. During the Enlightenment, thinkers in France and England often painted the Middle Ages as a dark, backward era dominated by superstition and cruelty. The term Dark Ages itself gained traction as intellectual branding. Progress needed a villain. Medieval Europe made a convenient one. What better symbol of barbarism than a woman literally padlocked between her legs? It was perfect propaganda. Industrial Europe prided itself on reason and refinement. Pointing backward at imagined iron panties allowed them to feel superior. It is the historical version of laughing at your embarrassing ancestor to prove how modern you are. The irony? Victorian society was arguably more sexually repressed in public than much of medieval Europe. They fainted at ankles but wrote medical treatises on hysteria. Yes, we are going there. Because many physical chastity belts displayed in museums today were manufactured in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some were theatrical props, some were moralizing curiosities. A few may have been anti-masturbation devices designed for medical or disciplinary use, particularly in the 19th century, when doctors warned that self-pleasure could cause insanity. You read that correctly. Victorian medicine feared hands more than swords. Meanwhile, actual medieval legal records focus on adultery cases handled in ecclesiastical courts. Punishments ranged from fines to public penance. Shame was the weapon of choice. Community gossip did the rest. No iron required. So you ask, were there ever any belts in the Middle Ages? There are scattered references to devices called girdles of chastity, but most scholars agree these were symbolic or literary. No verified archaeological evidence supports widespread medieval use. In fact, many museum pieces once labeled medieval have been redated to the Renaissance or later. Metallurgical analysis has embarrassed more than one curator. Oops. Turns out that terrifying relic was forged when powdered wigs were trendy. The Crusader myth survives because it is tidy. Jealous knight. Loyal wife, lock and key. It fits neatly into our expectations of a brutal age. But real medieval control was subtler. It lived in sermons warning women against vanity. in legal systems that privileged male inheritance, in social structures that made female sexuality a public concern. You ride back from Jerusalem now, older, thinner, changed. Your wife greets you at the gate. She is not wearing iron, but she is watched. And the watching might be worse, because steel can be removed. Reputation cannot, as you dismount. A thought creeps in. If the belt was not forged in the age of Crusaders, then perhaps it was forged in the age that claimed to have outgrown them. And that revelation is far more uncomfortable. The workshop of invention. You step into a 19th century workshop. Gas lamps hiss. Coal smoke hangs in the air. A metal worker wipes his hands on a rag and grins at a customer in a tailored coat. On the table between them lies a familiar shape, polished this time, decorative, almost elegant in its cruelty. The Industrial Revolution has arrived. Machinery hums. Empires expand. Museums fill with curiosities. Europe is cataloging the world and itself. And nothing sells quite like scandal from the so-called Dark Ages. Collectors crave relics. Entrepreneurs supply them. In cities like Paris and London, curiosity cabinets display instruments of torture. Iron maidens, spiked chairs, thumb screws. Many of these objects, scholars now agree, were either heavily modified or outright fabricated during the 18th and 19th centuries to satisfy public appetite for medieval horror. The chastity belt fits neatly into this marketplace of shock. Tourists gasp. Moralists shake their heads. Artists sketch dramatic scenes of imprisoned wives. Publishers print sensational illustrations. The Middle Ages become a Gothic theme park. It is branding, centuries before branding had a name, and the belt becomes a mascot for backwardness. Meanwhile, Victorian anxieties simmer beneath polished surfaces. Female sexuality is framed as fragile, volatile, in need of supervision. Medical texts warn that masturbation in young women leads to hysteria, epilepsy, even death. Doctors design devices to prevent nocturnal touching. Some are worn at night, some are locked. Now the iron has context. Not crusading husbands, concerned fathers, boarding schools, moral reformers. You realize something chilling. The myth of medieval chastity belts may have served to distract from contemporary practices of sexual control. If you paint the past as grotesque, your present looks civilized by comparison. Look at them, those medieval brutes. Never mind the devices in our own bedrooms. Hypocrisy ages well. The workshop owner lifts the belt and taps it. See the craftsmanship, he says. Authentic design. Authentic to what? Conrad Kaiser's satirical drawing? Renaissance imagination? Victorian paranoia? Historians in the 20th century begin to dismantle the myth systematically. Scholars like Albrecht Classen and others examine sources, artifacts, and texts. The conclusion grows consistent. There is no solid evidence of widespread medieval use of chastity belts as instruments of marital fidelity. That does not mean medieval society was sexually liberated. It was not. But its methods of control were social, legal, religious. Iron was spectacle. And spectacle sells. You run your fingers over the polished metal in that 19th century workshop and feel how smooth it is. How comfortable it appears compared to the jagged thing in the abbey chest from Section I. This one was made to be seen. To be displayed. To tell a story. And stories shape memory more effectively than facts. The customer nods approvingly. He imagines placing it in his private collection. Guests will gasp. Ladies will blush. Men will chuckle. The Middle Ages will look savage, and he will look enlightened. But here is the gut punch. Even if the belt was mostly fantasy, the fear behind it was not. Female sexuality has always been policed. Through gossip, through law, through theology, through medicine. The method changes. The motive remains. As the workshop door closes behind you, you feel a twist of unease. Because if the chastity belt is largely a Victorian invention about medieval control, then we have been laughing at the wrong century, and perhaps wearing subtler belts all along. The woman who refused the lock. You are no longer in a workshop or a chapel. You are in a small stone house in 14th century Italy. The year is 1378. The Great Schism fractures the church. 2 popes claim authority. Europe trembles under plague memory and political tension. Inside this house lives a woman named Lucia. She is not famous. No chronicle preserves her name. But imagine her anyway, because history is built on women like her. Her husband trades wool. He travels often. He worries about honor. Not because he owns her, but because reputation is currency. If Lucia is rumored unfaithful, contracts falter. Alliances strain. Rumor is lethal. Lucia walks through the marketplace. Eyes follow her, not kindly, just carefully. The baker's wife notes how long she lingers at the well. The priest notices her confession schedule. No iron circles her hips, yet she feels encased. Church courts in late medieval Italy prosecute adultery cases regularly. Penalties vary, but women often bear harsher social consequences. Public penance might require standing barefoot outside a church, veil removed, head bowed. The town watches. Surveillance without metal. Lucia knows the rules. Do not be alone with men. Do not laugh too loudly. Do not dress too boldly. Do not create suspicion. Desire is not just personal. It is political. One evening, her husband leaves for Florence. Weeks pass. A neighbor, Matteo, brings news of wool prices. He lingers. He compliments her bread. The air between them thickens. You feel it. Not romance. Not sin. Possibility. Lucia steps back, because one whisper could unravel her life. Here is the truth historians emphasize. Medieval communities operated on collective enforcement. Everyone knew everyone. Privacy barely existed. Reputation was a shared project. The church provided moral framework, but neighbors provided constant observation. In this system, a chastity belt would be redundant. Lucia resists not iron, but expectation, and yet, resistance happens. Records show women filing complaints against abusive husbands, seeking annulments for impotence, petitioning courts. Some entered convents voluntarily to escape marriage. Others conducted affairs discreetly despite risk. Human desire does not vanish because authority disapproves. It adapts. Lucia writes letters when her husband is gone. Careful letters. Innocent words with layered meaning. She meets Matteo only in public spaces. She laughs, but not too freely. She walks a blade edge. One night, a rumor sparks anyway. A girl claims she saw Lucia speaking to Matteo after sunset. The next Sunday, whispers swell in the pews. Lucia feels heat crawl up her spine. She knows how quickly reputation curdles. No belt clamps her body, but the town closes in. This is the real medieval. Device. Community. The priest calls her for questioning. You stand beside her in that dim chamber. No iron chains. No lock, just eyes, questions, tone, suspicion. Did you meet him alone? Did you touch? Did you intend sin? Intent matters in canon law. So does confession. Lucia denies impropriety. There is no proof. The accusation dissolves. For now. But the fear remains. Here is the haunting part. Centuries later, people will point to iron belts in museum cases and laugh at medieval cruelty. They will not feel the quieter cruelty of rumor. They will not see Lucia's careful steps, her measured smiles, her rehearsed denials. Steel makes noise. Shame whispers. As Lucia leaves the church that day, cleared but not cleansed of suspicion, she understands something brutal. She does not need a lock to be contained, and neither did most women of her age, which leaves you with an uncomfortable question. If the chastity belt was largely myth, crafted later to dramatize medieval control, why does the idea still feel so believable? And what invisible mechanisms today would look just as theatrical to someone 500 years from now? Steel in the case. You stand in a 19th century museum hall. Gaslight glows against glass. Velvet ropes keep the curious at bay. A placard reads medieval chastity belt, 12th century. The letters are confident. The iron inside the case is not. It gleams too evenly. The rivets are symmetrical in a way that feels industrial. The hinge is elegant. Decorative etching curls along the front plate like a flourish added for applause. A crowd gathers. A gentleman with a waxed mustache leans toward his companion and whispers about jealous crusaders. A woman gasps, half horrified, half fascinated. The Middle Ages perform their assigned role. Brutal, irrational, theatrically cruel. Here is what matters. By the 1800s, Europe was building an identity around progress. The Enlightenment had framed reason as salvation. The Industrial Revolution had turned iron into rails and bridges and empire. To prove how far you have advanced, you need a savage past to contrast it against. So the museum becomes a stage. Curators acquire objects from private collections, estate sales, questionable dealers. Provenance is often murky. Documentation is thin. If a piece looks medieval enough and fits a popular narrative, it earns a label. Medieval sells. Especially medieval sex. Many so-called chastity belts displayed in the 19th century were likely fabricated during that same century. Some were created as satire, others as cautionary curiosities. A few may have been medical devices repurposed and rebranded. Metallurgical testing in the 20th century began exposing the truth. Carbon dating, stylistic analysis, tool marks. Suddenly, the iron did not align with 12th century craftsmanship. It aligned with 18th or 19th century techniques. Awkward. Several museums quietly relabeled their belts as Renaissance or even later. Some removed them entirely. Others kept them, but added disclaimers. Translation: this thing probably never clanked around a crusader's wife. The irony hits hard. Victorian society, so eager to condemn medieval sexual repression, was simultaneously obsessed with controlling sexuality at home. Anti-masturbation campaigns targeted boys and girls. Physicians warned parents that self-touching caused madness, blindness, spinal weakness. Boarding schools monitored students at night. And yes, devices were invented to prevent it. Belts, cages, straps. Not for crusader wives, for children. Let that sink in. In 1871, a British doctor named Isaac Baker Brown advocated clitoridectomy to cure hysteria. The operation gained brief popularity before outrage shut it down. But the underlying fear remained. Uncontrolled female sexuality threatened social order. Steele returned, just under a different justification. You circle the museum case again. The belt inside is polished, displayed, neutralized by glass. It is safer to imagine medieval husbands as monsters than to confront the anxieties of modernity. Because if the belt belongs to the Victorians, then the story flips. The age that prided itself on enlightenment may have engineered some of the most invasive sexual controls in Western history. The Middle Ages did not need iron underwear to maintain power structures. They used theology, inheritance law, and communal oversight. The 19th century added hardware. And then blamed the past. The gentleman in the museum nods knowingly. How barbaric they were, he says. You almost laugh. Barbaric compared to what? The Industrial Revolution also gave us factories that consumed children's labor, colonial regimes that extracted wealth through violence, medical experiments justified by pseudoscience. Progress has sharp edges. The chastity belt myth persists because it simplifies. It compresses centuries of complex social control into a single dramatic object. You can point at it, photograph it, sell tickets with it. It is much harder to display a sermon, or a law code, or the quiet terror of reputation. As you leave the museum hall, you glance back at the iron silhouette in the glass. It looks ancient. It feels theatrical. And it might be the most successful marketing campaign in historical memory, because once a myth becomes profitable, it is very hard to unlock. Law without locks. Now step backward again, not into a museum. Into a medieval courtroom. The year is 1250. England. A diocesan court convenes under ecclesiastical authority. The bishop's official presides. The air smells of parchment and damp wool. A woman stands accused of adultery. No belt, no chains. Just testimony. Canon law treats marriage as sacred. Adultery is sin, yes, but also social disruption. Inheritance disputes erupt when paternity is questioned. Property flows through legitimate heirs. Land equals power. Power equals survival. The church does not need iron to defend this system, that it has paperwork. Witnesses testify. Neighbors describe suspicious glances. A servant mentions a late-night visit. The accused woman denies everything. The man allegedly involved denies as well. Sworn oaths carry weight. Perjury risks damnation. Truth in this court is negotiated through reputation. Punishment, if guilt is proven, often involves public penance. Walking barefoot, holding a candle. Standing before the congregation. Sometimes fines, occasionally separation. Social humiliation does more long-term damage than steel ever could, because steel restains the body. Shame restrains the future. And yet, the system is not entirely one-sided. Medieval women used church courts strategically. They sued for separation on grounds of cruelty. They alleged impotence to annul marriages. They claimed forced consent. Records from England, France, and Italy reveal women actively navigating legal structures. This is not a cartoon of universal helplessness. It is a dense web of power, negotiation, vulnerability, and strategy. The chastity belt myth erases that complexity. It reduces medieval women to passive victims locked in iron. Reality was harsher and subtler. Control operated through doctrine, community, and economic dependence. Let me explain why that matters. If you imagine medieval society as physically chaining women, you miss how effective ideological systems can be. You underestimate how belief, fear, and honor can shape behavior without visible restraint. A belt is obvious. A worldview is not. You watch the accused woman in the 1250 courtroom lift her chin. She refuses to confess. Without proof, the case weakens. The court issues a warning instead of a sentence. She leaves intact. Her reputation, however, is fragile. For months, perhaps years, she will feel eyes on her. Not because iron encircles her body, but because suspicion lingers. This is the medieval mechanism. And it is powerful. When later centuries projected chastity belts backward, they simplified this system into spectacle. They traded nuance for shock value. It is easier to gasp at iron than to grapple with theology. As the courtroom empties, you feel the weight of parchment and ink more heavily than any metal plate, because law codifies expectation, and expectation, once internalized, becomes self-policing. No key required. The myth of cold steel distracts from cold doctrine. And that distraction may have been intentional. Because if you convince people the past was physically monstrous, they may ignore how mental and moral constraints persist in new forms. The woman exits into sunlight. No iron clinks against her steps, yet she walks carefully. Always carefully. And that carefulness echoes louder than chains. Fetish, fantasy, and the afterlife of iron. Now we move into the shadows where myth evolves. The 20th century inherits the chastity belt as cultural shorthand, novels, comics, adult humor, Renaissance fairs. The belt becomes punchline and prop. It drifts from historical claim into erotic fantasy. Control sells, restriction becomes titillation. Iron that once symbolized oppression now appears in fetish subcultures, stripped of moral panic and recontextualized as consensual play. The object morphs, lighter materials, adjustable locks, not imposed by church or husband, but negotiated between partners. History twists. What was allegedly a medieval instrument of enforced purity becomes, in some modern contexts, a voluntary symbol of trust, power exchange, or erotic experimentation. Consent changes everything. And yet, the original myth still lingers in textbooks, casual conversations, and lazy documentaries. Medieval equals barbaric. Crusader equals jealous jailer. The narrative is sticky because it fits our appetite for extremes. But scholars continue to dismantle it. Academic consensus holds firm. There's no credible evidence that chastity belts were widely used in the Middle Ages to control wives during Crusades. Surviving artifacts overwhelmingly date to later centuries. Literary references are satirical or symbolic. So why does the image refuse to die? Because it condenses centuries of anxiety about female sexuality into one unforgettable silhouette. You can draw it in a single line. You cannot draw canon law so easily. You scroll through modern discussions online. Memes circulate, jokes about knights and keys. Rarely does anyone cite Conrad Kaiser or museum redating. The myth has outrun the footnotes. And here is the unsettling thought. Every era creates simplified villains in its past to feel morally superior. The Victorians did it to the Middle Ages. We sometimes do it to the Victorians. It is a cycle. The chastity belt becomes a mirror, reflecting whoever needs a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, real mechanisms of control adapt. Laws about reproductive rights, cultural expectations around modesty, digital surveillance, reputation managed through algorithms instead of parish gossip. The materials change. The impulse does not. You hold a modern replica belt in your hands. Lightweight, polished, marketed online, no sermons attached. No Crusader myth required. It feels almost harmless. But the original story it carries was never just about iron. It was about fear of desire destabilizing order. That fear is ancient. And it survives. As you set the replica down, you realize the myth has had a long afterlife. It traveled from satire to museum case, to punchline, to fetish object. It mutated, but it never vanished. Because it was never only about the Middle Ages. It was about control dressed up as protection. And that costume still fits uncomfortably well. The lot you cannot see. Return to the chapel. Return to the chest. Return to the iron shape that started this descent. You open the lid. Again. This time, you see it differently. Not as medieval certainty. Not as Crusader hardware, but as layered myth. Victorian theater. Modern fantasy. Cultural anxiety fossilized in metal. The candlelight trembles across its surface. You think of Lucia in 14th century Italy, navigating rumor instead of rivets. You think of the 1250 courtroom, where shame weighed more than steel. You think of 19th century workshops forging objects to sell a narrative of barbaric ancestors. You think of museum halls where visitors nod at the superiority of their own age. And you think of now. Because here's the haunting reflection. The Middle Ages did regulate sexuality. Through doctrine, through law, through community. They feared illegitimacy, moral chaos, divine punishment. They were not naive about desire. They were vigilant. But the iconic iron chastity belt, locked by crusading husbands for years at a time, belongs mostly to imagination and later invention. Cold steel was rare. Propaganda was plentiful. The myth served purposes. It mocked medieval men as insecure tyrants. It allowed Victorians to project cruelty backward. It provided a dramatic emblem of repression for modern storytellers. And it stuck, because we prefer visible villains. Invisible systems are harder to confront. You run your fingers over the iron edge once more. It is heavy, but not as heavy as a culture's expectations. Imagine someone centuries from now studying our era. What objects will they display in glass cases? What practices will they exaggerate to prove their own enlightenment? What invisible constraints will they fail to notice because they are living inside them? Every age believes it has unlocked the past. Every age forges new locks. The priest's voice echoes in memory. You do not understand what this is. Now you do. It is not a medieval certainty. It is a story about power. About who controls bodies. About how easily we mistake spectacle for truth. Chest. The iron disappears into darkness again. But the real question remains in the air. Sharp as cold metal against skin. If the chastity belt was largely a fantasy designed to make one era look monstrous, what myths are we forging right now that future generations will hold up, shake their heads at, and call barbaric.